Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of OVA Hour, a monthly webinar series focusing on the science behind issues related to women's health, well-being, and longevity, and especially the critical role female reproductive biology plays in every aspect of a woman's life. My name is Brian Van Weel, and I'm the Chief Philanthropic Officer at the Buck Institute. The Buck is the world's first and leading independent research institute dedicated solely to the study of aging and applying breakthroughs in science to ending age-related decline and disease and helping us all live healthier, longer lives. In each OVA Hour episode, we invite leading scientists, doctors, and thought leaders to join us in conversation and to share what we know, don't know, and what burning questions science still needs to answer about women's health. Questions around fertility and reproductive span. And can new breakthroughs in science offer women more options and choices? And can we better understand and hopefully alleviate the negative health consequences experienced during menopause and life after menopause? These are areas of research and science that have been traditionally understudied and underfunded. And that's exactly why we launched our new Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality at the Buck over 2 years ago. And why we're bringing OVA Hour to you: to raise awareness, share the most up-to-date science-backed information available, and to accelerate scientific discovery. We're excited about this new direction, and we invite you to join us on this journey. Before I turn things over to our esteemed panelists, Dr. Jennifer Garrison and Dr. Lizellen Follette, let me first point out a few Zoom items. During the conversation, all guests will remain muted. However, we really do want and encourage your questions. To submit a question anytime during the webinar, just click on the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. Using the Q&A rather than the chat feature will get your questions directly into the queue for our speakers. We may not be able to get to all of your questions, but we will send out replies to any questions we couldn't get to everyone who registered for today's session. And finally, keep an eye on that chat window, especially as we approach the end of the webinar, for information and links related to today's session and how you can get more involved in this exciting research. Thanks again for joining us today. Now let me turn things over to Dr. Garrison.
I'm really excited to be here. As Brian mentioned, we're going to be having these monthly webinar series where we talk about reframing women's health through the lens of reproductive longevity and equality. And particularly with the second webisode, we want to talk about the things that were, the biggest questions that people had after the first one. And those are really around menopause and particularly hormone replacement therapy. So I'm really excited to have a conversation today with Lizellen Follette. She is an OBGYN here in Marin. She is passionately dedicated to women's health, and she has an incredible background and history in this area. So, welcome, Lizellen.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And, before we dive into hormone replacement therapy and thinking about these questions for women who've gone through menopause, I wanted to take a step back because I think it's really important, and Lizellen was the one who pointed this out to me. I think it's really important that people in the audience who are not scientists come away from this with a better grasp of how to think about the data and the science that's presented to them. Right? Part of what we want to do with this webinar is to examine some of the prevalent ideas in women's health and, give them a critical look and in some cases, maybe even debunk them.
Yeah, I think one of the best things that we can educate as part of this whole series is for people to understand that a media headline does not represent science. And so if we go a little deeper to help you go a little deeper, then we can critically assess the benefits and the risks of anything.
Exactly. Okay, so when I'm approaching a study that I hear about, for example, in the news, what do I do? What do you do? First thing is to look at where the study came from. So actually going back to the original paper, most people get their science through news, right, but actually clicking through and asking what is that original document where the study was published. And you might not understand everything that's in it, but there are some things you can look for, right?
I mean, I think one of the best ways to think about it is the way we look at it as scientists is we look at what were they trying, what was the aim of the study, what did they think they were going to try to prove, and then what the conclusion was of what they proved. And then the next level is what we are talking about is critically looking at how many people, Did they really randomize? What are they looking at? What do we know before this study? What did we learn after this study? Because I think those are the things that really make a big difference.
Exactly. And, statistics. So, as a human, as a scientist, I can be biased without even meaning to be, but math doesn't lie. And so when you're looking at a study, you want to look at what kind of statistical tests they did, and did they find statistical significance? Because what that means is, when we have two groups like a placebo and a test group, if there are differences between them, statistics will basically tell you whether those differences are real and can be believed, or whether they are no better than random chance, right?
And that idea of random chance, which we don't even think about, is so important, because unless one of the best things that has happened now in terms of using very advanced math, whether it's artificial intelligence, is that before you start a study, you actually need to know how many numbers in each group do you have to be able to show statistical significance. And so now you don't even start something until you know you can, what we call, power the study to be able to get to a conclusion that you hope you may reach, or a conclusion completely different, but at least it's powered to answer that.
That's right. So it takes into account things like what was the sample size. It takes into account a lot of things, but statistics are your friend when you're thinking about whether or not you believe a scientific study. And I would say the most important thing when I'm looking at a paper is, has it been repeated? Right? Mm-hmm. So, there are exploratory studies, early stage studies are always very exciting, but we want to see those results repeated. And that really gives you confidence.
But the other thing is, you as a scientist and me sort of as educated scientists from the perspective of being able to understand it, it doesn't matter that Jennifer was able to prove one thing. I want somebody else somewhere else to be able to ask the same question and come up with the same idea. One of the problems we've gotten into in science sometimes is the fact that it's been a one-off, and yet no one else has ever been able to reach that same conclusion. What does that tell you? It tells you there's something wrong with that science, because it either happened or it didn't happen.
Right, exactly. Okay, so if we're going to dive into hormone replacement therapy and menopause, there's a few basic things that we wanted to talk about first, just to get everybody on the same page. So hormone replacement therapy is always going to be some combination of estrogen alone or estrogen with progesterones. However, the type of estrogens, there's many different types of estrogens, there's different types of progesterones, and what combination of things you're using really makes a difference. But if we step back even further, what is estrogen?
Right. Right, here you go. Exactly. So, and I'm just going to quickly say that the way I think about estrogen is, are you using something that is what your body used to make? Is it going through the liver? And does that have a consequence, namely oral? Can you use it in a non-oral way, namely through the skin, like a patch? And then the progestin has its own set of rules and set of receptors and set of concerns. And how are the ways that we can also give estrogen and give progesterone, namely, can it be through the skin? Can it be oral? So those are the things that we will actually tease out a little bit. But I wanted Jennifer to really talk to us about the estrogen receptor and what do we know about estrogen and its receptors, and how does it function both in real life?
In real life? Yeah, in our bodies, actually, right now. Well, so estrogen obviously is a hormone, and a hormone is a chemical that your body uses to signal between basically distant places, so different tissues, within a tissue, long distances. And the way that it works is that estrogen by itself can't do anything, right? So it's one piece of the puzzle, but there's another equally important piece, which is the receptor. And when I say receptor, you can think about it kind of like a receiver. And if we simplify it even a little bit more, if estrogen is a key, then the receptor is the lock, right? And so each lock, if there's one key, you can have multiple locks in different places, but you need both of those things to open the door.
Right, exactly.
And essentially when estrogen, it fits, and we're calling it a key because it kind of fits in the receptor like a lock and a key. So estrogen can only bind to its own receptors, progesterone, other things aren't binding to it. And estrogen receptor isn't doing anything unless estrogen is there. So you need those two pieces. And, it gets a little bit more complicated when you think about, okay, what are the sources of the estrogen? Where are they coming from?
Right, exactly.
And where are the receptors? Where are these receivers?
Right.
And the answer is that they can, they're expressed all over the place. So you've got estrogen coming from, reproductive tissues for sure, but also lots of other tissues in your body. And then you've got the receptors expressed in reproductive tissues, but also expressed in the heart, in the liver, in the bone, in the brain, all over the place.
And I always think about estrogen and estrogen receptor as sort of a puzzle piece, but that puzzle piece has to fit together to then drive action. So it's like it's a 1-2 punch, but then from there, a whole other series of events can happen. The other interesting thing is what we're learning in the basic science that is so important that is happening at the Buck has to do with, did you really think there was an estrogen receptor in your brain? I mean, did you really think there was one in your gut? Did you think there was one in your blood vessels? And the answer is probably yes to everything. I don't know all of those things on the basic science front, but Jennifer does better. But from the perspective of this is a ubiquitous hormone that therefore has different actions in different tissues, and we need to better understand how it works, when it works, and when it doesn't work.
Exactly. The when and the where are absolutely critical to understanding what happens after the lock and the key get together, right? So in different places in your brain, for example, versus your liver, when that lock and key get together, different things happen. And so, thinking about hormone replacement therapy, ideally what you want, as Lizellen said, is to have, to replace the thing that your body was actually making originally.
Yes.
But then you want to deliver it to the appropriate place at the appropriate time. And unfortunately, what happens with age in women is that there are changes in when and where and how much of that receptor or that lock is expressed. And so, you can put back as much estrogen as you want, but if there's no
place for it to
land, then it's not going to do anything. So that's something that I wanted everyone to keep in mind while we're talking about hormone replacement therapy. All right.
And one of the things that was really important about that has to do with the timeline. One of the things about women and the whole CRLE perspective is the event about the ovary and how ovarian function changes really creates a cascade of things that over time you lose that estrogen receptor, which means it doesn't matter what you give it. If that receptor is gone, the effect that you want isn't going to happen like the lock and key. So one of the things that we need to understand is if hormones change in women at a certain point more dramatically than perhaps as we see in men, one of the things that we want to try to understand is how can we get that to not be such a drastic on-off switch? And is there a way for us to capture the gradual change of those receptors and bring them back into function?
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's jump into this. The question really that we want to address here is estrogen beneficial to women when you administer it postmenopausally? And I would say there's a lot of contradictory evidence in this area. And so we want to go through kind of what we know, what we think is true from the data, and then where we need to go from here. So, there were decades of research across thousands and thousands of women, tens of thousands of women, that basically showed that giving estrogen back to women postmenopause had a beneficial effect on heart function. Now, this is important because what is the #1 killer of women over the age of 65?
So it turns out to be 53% women die of heart disease or stroke. So cardiovascular events take 50% of the women, beyond 50% of the women. So if you think about a cause of death, if we have ways to actually, make things better on that front, it's really going to be important. The other part, though, that you're talking about is the scientific evidence before the sort of earthquake event, which is we're going to get to, which is the WHI study. There was a lot of data to suggest not only was estrogen great, but there was no harm. You couldn't not do better with it.
Do no harm.
Right. And so they thought it was better for your heart. They thought it was better for your sex life. They thought it was better for everything that you could think of. And probably some of that stuff wasn't right. But so you were in the background in the 70s and 80s, and to some extent in the 90s, that estrogen was the best. And with that in mind, people then asked, could we add estrogen later to women and protect them against heart disease and stroke, which is the #1 cause of death for women?
Yeah, exactly. So there was this evidence out there, and in 2002, there's a clinical study published by the NIH called the Women's Health Initiative, which garnered a huge amount of press. And the reason that it was picked up so widely and spread so widely is because suddenly, after all of this data had been around for so long, suddenly the WHI study said, well, actually, it turns out that estrogen does not protect against heart disease in postmenopausal women, and it induces a higher risk of breast cancer, in those women, which, was like, okay, stop the presses. And this led a lot of clinicians to stop prescribing hormone replacement therapy to women, and it led a lot of women to shy away from it for, really, I think, good reason.
Well,
they were scared.
Exactly. But one of the things I want to go back on is the background information of design of this study, which was done between 93 and 97, and it was discontinued after the 5 years because of one of the concerns that they had. The premise of the study was you could add estrogen to women's lives and protect them against cardiovascular risk and heart disease and stroke. So the premise was not, we will do other things. The premise was we're taking late postmenopausal women, so 63 and above, that was the mean age of the women, and adding hormones back, despite the fact that there had been a long time since menopause, in the hopes that we would actually prevent cardiovascular disease, plaque, narrowing of the arteries, et cetera. And so I think we have to understand where they started from as a premise, because it got a little wonky later, but initially they were thinking not only is hormones great, but the data has been that it could be protective. The problem with these studies, of course, and we'll get to some of this, has to do with you're asking for an endpoint that takes 10 and 15 and 20 years to develop. So to quit,
by endpoint, you mean?
In other words, if you're really going to protect against heart disease and plaque, you want to be able to see that the vascular resistance, so your blood supply and the pressure at which your blood flows, does not get stiffer with age, and that change, that vascular change in terms of a thickness of a vessel, may take 10, 15, 20 years to develop to be able to then be clinically significant in the form of a heart attack or a stroke, right?
So let's all right. So let's step back and let's talk about this study from the perspective of what we started with, which is let's give it a critical lens and see how it turns out. So number one, who were the participants? How old were they? How were they chosen?
Well, so a couple things. So first of all, to remind everybody that the study was picked, the publication was in 2002, but the study was done between 93 and 97. So they chose 8,600 women in each of these arms. There were multiple arms, but the arms that we're talking about are really the ones that had estrogen and progesterone and placebo. And they chose women who were 63. So the average age was 63.
But what was the range?
And the range was, I think it was 45 to 75, but the representation of the early menopausal women was quite small. It was about 3%.
And now, so let's remind everybody, what is the average age of menopause? This by
51.
Yeah.
So just that fact alone, 51, you're asking for a cardiovascular protective effect in women who are 12 years and beyond menopause, right?
So they've been missing menopause for 10 to 12 years.
And
many of these women, their reproductive organs had never seen hormone replacement therapy, right? And why does that matter?
So I think that the idea of this receptor idea, right? If you've seen it before, you may in fact be able to capture receptors and not lose them at the same level. So if they are naive to something, whatever receptors they may have had at 51 by 63
are gone, right? They're just gone. And so again, if you can have as many keys as you want, but if there's no locks, nothing's going to happen. But separately from that, okay, so the age range is off. So those earlier studies that we talked about, where there's tens of thousands of women where the estrogen has shown a beneficial effect on heart function. How old were those women?
So some of the better studies were actually obviously younger women, which is one of the big topics about this. It's like the sweet spot of time.
Exactly.
And so
they were 33 to 55.
Right.
So much younger.
Right.
Okay, so beyond that,
Right.
how many of these women entering the study had pre-existing cardiovascular disease risk?
So it's interesting, quite a large percentage. And the interesting thing is, if you were going to pick a group of people, of women, obviously, to be able to see that you could see a protective effect, they really were calling people that already had risk factors, right? Sedentary lifestyle, they were heavier, they had cardiac risk, if not cardiac disease already. And so I think one of the problems is you're trying to change their physiology at a time in which it's happened for 12 and 15 years post-menopause. If you take the assumption that all those other studies that showed that hormones and having estrogen and cycling protects your vascular system, namely your heart and your head and other vessels, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so all of those things are suspect.
Yes.
I would call them suspect.
Yes, good.
So if you take those two things together, the age of the women and their either their risk for or their pre-existing cardiac issues, the estimates are that somewhere around 10% of the women in the study were actually capable of receiving a beneficial effect from estrogen. Right.
And maybe would have had they kept the study going another 10 years.
Right, exactly. And we now know from a study that was published about 5 years ago and a couple of follow-ups from that the age at which you start administering estrogen or hormone replacement therapy to women with respect to menopause is incredibly important. Right. Again, the when and the where. Right. So, if you start it within 6 years of the onset of menopause, there's a beneficial effect. Right. If you get to 10 years post-menopause and you start then, there's no effect. And there are even some studies that have shown that if you give it to women who are far past menopause, 15, 20 years past, that it might even have a detrimental effect on heart function. Right?
Well, if you think about the receptor idea, right, and the closest you are to menopause, or for that matter, premenopausal, if you think about your blood supply and your blood vessels of having estrogen receptors on there to keep everything pliable, if you think about that, every day that you go beyond having the estrogen, whether it's endogenous, your own function, or it actually is something that you're given exogenously, right? So whether it's a patch, whether it's a pill, that will keep that population of estrogen receptors happy and present. And therefore, you could imagine over time that would proactively help issues of vascular stiffness and therefore narrowing of the arteries that could lead to a stroke or to a heart attack. Mm-hmm. So that this idea that the sweet spot of timing is so important because of how important people understand that every body part has a role with this receptor. And if you start to not feed the receptor, I guess that's one way to look at it, right? Then you're going to lose the ability to influence that organ with that hormone.
All right. Okay. The other question is, what kind of hormone replacement therapy were these women given? What was the actual?
So of course, in the 90s, so this is the late 90s. I got out of residency in 92. And we were already getting a little suspect about using mare's urine, Premarin, which was the estrogen they were using, and Provera, which was the progesterone that they were using. They were using one formulation and one formulation only, and it was continuous conjugated estrogens in the form of Premarin and progesterone in the form of Provera. So the Prem Pro was the agent, Premarin and Provera. It was a daily concoction of both.
And how were they administering it?
Orally.
Okay.
So really important. There was only one way to give it, and it was given orally.
And now, so we touched on this a little while ago, but the way you administer hormone replacement therapy, why is it so important? So orally versus a patch, like who cares? What difference does it make? So except that you don't have to remember to take a pill.
Right, exactly. One of the things that we've learned early on in hematology, one of the studies that you and I talked about is, I worked in a hematology lab in medical school, and we were looking at birth control pills, and we were trying to understand why did birth control pills cause clots, right? Mm-hmm. So vascular clots were associated with doses of birth control pills. Mm-hmm. Well, the hematologist that I worked with showed that as soon as you take an oral hormone, and particularly estrogen, especially in the formulation and the doses of a pill, every clotting factor, there are 12 clotting factors, double. Every clotting factor double. So it is not a great stretch for anybody to understand that you take an oral pill, you're going to get a clot, or potentially if you're sedentary on an airplane and not moving your legs. So there's some certain circumstances that you can avoid, but the reality is you've just changed your whole clotting cascade and you've increased it, so the risk is higher. Mm-hmm. Now, the same thing can be true with Premarin and Provera in that it goes through the liver. Mm-hmm. Now, you have both the stomach acidifies and therefore metabolizes some of this, so you're going to lose some of the ingredients, but it goes through the liver and then gets a bump in terms of the clotting factors.
And what happens in the liver, so thinking about the clotting factors as maybe a downstream effect, is that estrogen can be broken down, by enzymes that are there. And so this is a third component of the signaling system that we probably don't have to think about too much, except when it comes to mode of delivery. So the thing about the transdermal patch is that it bypasses the liver. And so, if you as a physician were prescribing this to your patients, what would you give them?
So because we are still understanding some of the data that really gave estrogen such a bad name, I wouldn't say we're understanding it. I think we've gotten a pretty good understanding of it, but we for the purpose of this particular webinar is to sort of help you understand how to look at these things. I really do sit down with patients and say, look, mode of delivery makes a difference. The type of hormones make a difference. The timing of progesterone and the length of duration of progesterone. One of the other arms of this study looked at progesterone itself as maybe being the factor that made a difference in terms of cancer. And talking about the risks and the benefits, because all we heard about was the risk of breast cancer, which we know was not statistically significant.
Yeah, can we just step back for a second?
Right.
And so, this is the big surprise, was that the risk for increased breast cancer and also the lack of benefit to heart health.
Right.
Neither of those were statistically significant to this data.
Right, exactly.
It was a trend.
And we missed the fact that we protected women against bone loss and osteoporosis, and we protected women against colon cancer. So those themselves are whole issues that we completely lost. And the interesting thing about the women who stopped based on their doctor's recommendation, based on this one study that shows estrogen may in fact give you an increased risk of breast cancer, again, statistically not significant, was that women then went on and fractured a hip. And if you look at the statistics of women who break a hip and go on and die because of the surgeries and everything that goes along with hip replacement surgery and being in the hospital and all the rest of it, the mortality is extremely high. So we really have hurt people without ever explaining to them the pros and cons of the risk of what they could be doing. And I think that's really one of the important messages.
Yes. Okay. So I think we've pretty much covered the design flaws in the WHI study.
Yeah, good.
And I think it's fair to say that we don't place too much stock in those results.
That's correct.
Not those results.
Right.
There are some things that they did that definitely are worth looking at. But all right. So stepping back from that, let's talk about what hormone replacement therapy might look like today. Let's talk about what we know. Let's talk about what we need to learn. And I want to hear from your perspective, Lizellen, as a physician. What kind of advice do you give to women who come in, and ask you about this when they're getting close to menopause?
Well, it's a fabulous question because everybody comes in with their concerns, what they've heard, and then how does it apply to them. So I think the first thing is, I'll give you an example of last week. I had a very active 62-year-old patient who was very thin and was worried about bone loss. She was a physical therapist and she knew about bone loss, and I could tell she was small framed. That was a big worry. She had been on hormone replacement therapy as an oral medicine, interestingly enough, from the time of menopause. And now she's seeing me as a new patient at 62. And her question is, actually, the reason why she came was because her primary care said, you have to stop hormones. And she wanted another opinion.
Now, why would her primary care doctor tell her
Because
that?
her primary care doctor is still living under the assumption that hormone replacement therapy is bad, and the recommendations out there, although they are very luckily, if you start to talk to cardiologists and you start to talk to the Northern American Menopause Society, that the recommendation out there still is you take it for 5 years and you stop.
Right, 5 years and then done.
Right, which
Okay.
of course, if you think about cardiac risk again, that takes 10 and 15 years to develop. So, stopping at 5 years, you don't know what you've done for that particular protection.
Right.
So anyway, so my conversation with her was, okay, here's the risk and benefits. Number one, the best news is you've been on it. Those little receptors in all of your body systems are still there. So we have active receptors that if we withdraw hormones, we will then start to lose them, and we will lose the positive. And some of the benefit, most of the benefit in terms of your peripheral vascular resistance and your bone and your heart.
Right. We didn't actually touch on this at the beginning of this hour, but we
Right.
talked about it. I talked about it last time. The idea that menopause is really, truly the worst thing that can happen to a healthy woman's
Right.
body, right? So going through menopause, which essentially means that ovaries stop functioning and they stop producing these hormones, it increases risk of not just heart disease, but
Right.
cognitive decline,
That's right.
osteoporosis,
That's right.
bone fractures, metabolic dysfunction. There's a whole host of, a whole constellation of health risks that come
Right.
along with going through menopause. So, the idea is that if we could try to replace some of the hormones that are lost when ovaries stop functioning, that would go a long
That's
way
right.
towards improving
Exactly.
the quality of women's lives.
Right. And I think that one of the things we have to, what we're trying to do is to maintain a subphysiologic amount of estrogen to get the benefits at each of the organ systems, the brain, the blood vessels, the ovaries, in the bone particularly. Exactly. And so I think one of the things we have to remember always has to do with how are we going to be able to continue through life better, healthier, longer, with good cognitive function, despite the fact that for all of us that are women, we lose ovarian function at a time when we are really midlife.
Yeah, midlife, that's right. These days, I think a lot of women will live more years after menopause than before, which is terrifying from my perspective as a woman.
Well,
who has not yet gone through menopause.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. It's not that bad.
Okay.
I made it. Yeah.
All right. So you have a 62-year-old
Right.
in your office.
Right.
And so you're.
So I have a benefit, right? She's
Right.
been on hormones. She's not been on the modality that I want, right? I don't want her on the orals. I want her on the transdermals, and I want to cycle her progesterone. We haven't talked a little bit about the progesterone, but one of the things that the studies have shown, the original part of the study that almost reached statistical significance, is for the women who did not have a uterus and they gave them estrogen alone, they had less breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So those were earlier, younger women, and they almost reached statistical significance, which the breast cancer did not reach.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you this idea, this completely contradictory terms,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So for her,
why is the uterus important? So have the uterus, not have the uterus? What difference does that make?
Because we're looking now that progesterone may negate some of the positive effects of estrogen.
Because progesterone receptors are located and all over the place,
Right.
but definitely in the uterus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we learned in the 60s and 70s that if you add estrogen without progesterone over time, and it may be 15 years, it may be 5, the uterine lining can get thick and cause uterine cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a no-no to be able to have someone on estrogen without the protective effects of cyclic progestin from the uterine front. So if they don't have a uterus, you don't have to worry about that concern.
Right. And the contradiction is that there are studies, and actually the WHI study showed this a little bit, that progestin can have a detrimental effect on the beneficial effects of estrogen on the heart, right?
Yes.
So it can actually interfere with the estrogen key binding to its receptor.
Yes.
So this comes back to, how much, when, and where. So the levels, the type of the form of the hormones that you're giving, when you're giving them, how you're giving them, it's all, it's complicated. But this is what science is for.
Right.
We should be able to work this out.
Well, if you think about the time in a doctor's office, right, you need to kind of carve out a half an hour, right? Because here we are talking about this and talking about the risk and benefits, but I need to be able to go through all this stuff. This patient that came to me, it was easy. She'd been on hormones, so I wasn't going to let her fall off the cliff, right? But it also meant that the protective effects were there and may in fact continue to make a difference in terms of her bone, which is really one of her.
But what about her concern, or maybe the concern she gleaned from her primary care doctor about breast cancer?
Yes, so that I think the breast cancer conversation has to be over time, right? The risk that they showed, the assumption is that it takes a breast cancer 7 to 10 years before we can detect it. So if you think about the fact that they stopped the study in 5 years, whatever breast cancers were quietly percolating in those women, and by the way, there were 8 women that got breast cancer on Premarin and Provera compared. The difference was 8, exactly 8 out of 8,600 women over 5 years. The idea was that you couldn't have cause and effect. It's this idea of co-traveler and confounding variable. You couldn't have gotten breast cancer that quick from the medicine they were giving them because it had to have been there before for us to detect it. Right. And even if you take the worst case scenario in which you think it might blossom something, right, then the answer is that's one of the risks we have to talk about. We have to
1%.
Yes, 1% a year is what it looks like. Yes,
but not statistically significant.
Exactly. So
okay, all right. So you're telling her essentially you have to weigh the risk benefit, right? And so what are the things that go into measuring risk for an individual? Because this is going to be different for every woman, right?
Yes, exactly. So what is their family history? What is their personal history? What is the...
And by family history, you mean history of breast cancer?
I'm talking about cancer, uterine cancers, yes, any female cancers typically, but I ask them about cancers anyway, because remember, we're starting to learn more in this. If we eventually get to personalized medicine, that there are certain people that carry genes that may give them a different risk of breast cancer, and therefore they have to actually be called out from the sort of normal risk, right?
And by personal history, do you mean smoking?
Yes.
Things like that.
Sedentary. So the risk factors that we know for breast cancer are, and cancer in general, right? Smoking, sedentary lifestyle, obesity, diabetes, right? So those are the biggies, right? And so I go through all that risk. Now, in her case, she was worried about bone, and I was worried about her bone, right? So
she said she was small.
She is small framed, and she is postmenopausal and has been protected of bone loss. So how quickly does the bone loss decrease when you stop hormones? In 2 years. So when you are weighing benefits and risk, if you say, because you are worried about a cancer risk that's about 1% a year, and your fracture risk is much, much higher than that in 2 years, that has to be weighed in terms of, what's the incidence.
And fracture is really like the worst thing that can
yes,
happen
of course,
in terms of osteoporosis, but there's so many other, quality of life issues that happen to women who have severe osteoporosis, right?
Right. Well, if you think about mobility, so we want mobility because you have vascular flow, and you want mobility because you have skeletal function, right? So you're losing skeletal function without estrogen, and we know that. And the whole Atul Gawande's wonderful book about his father dying and the changes of the skeleton and allowing his father to swallow shows that it's not just that you're getting hunched over, but you're changing the pitch of the head so that the chance of you gagging or having problems swallowing is so much higher. So you have this constellation of problems related to real decrease in skeletal function.
Okay, so let's take another example. So tell me, like, if you have someone come in and they've, for example, have a history of breast cancer in their family, or have some risk factors that, are due to lifestyle choices.
Yes. So I will always talk to people about lifestyle choices first, right? So, exercise, watching your weight, we probably are underestimated the blood sugar problem and the constellation of things that happen with blood sugars in terms of decreasing a healthy life, right? So watching blood sugars, I always try to draw their hemoglobin A1C, which is something that a lot of people don't do. But I want to know, are you really paying attention to sugar? Are you somebody that's going to have a problem?
What does hemoglobin A1C
It's
tell
looking
you?
at the last 3 months of blood sugars.
Okay.
So that's kind of fun.
Mhm.
So anyway, so I talked to them about risk and benefits. I try to have this conversation, and look how long it's taken us.
Yeah.
Right? So, and then they get a choice.
Mhm.
But I'm going to steer them in the direction that I think is safe. I'm going to be watching them. I'm not going anywhere. They're not going anywhere. So it's going to continue to be a conversation. Other risk factors come up, then we change our plan.
Okay. So this is where we're at,
Yeah.
right? You're taking everything that we know in the literature and the science and synthesizing that information, taking into account the individual person in front of you and giving them a recommendation.
Yes.
So
That's my job
the
as
state
their
of the-
doctor. Yes.
But that's where we are. That's
Right.
the state of the art.
Right. Exactly.
And it would be great, maybe we can provide a list of questions that women might want to ask their doctors
Right,
when
exactly.
they're going into an appointment like this.
Yeah. They might want to do it before the appointment so the doctor's ready.
Yeah.
Right? Because you think about how long it's
Yeah.
taken us to talk about
like
it.
12 minutes with them. You gotta talk really fast.
Come on, give me all the questions first.
Really, really fast. Yeah. Okay, so that's where we are now.
Right.
And then, I wanted to take a minute just to think about like where we could go, right?
Right.
So a lot of what we do here is to try to think about how can we accelerate the science? How can we take discoveries that are made in the lab and translate them to either therapeutics or diagnostics or
perfect.
products for women faster? And
Right.
that is really what we're doing here at the Buck Institute with the Reproductive Longevity and Equality Initiatives. So
Right.
the center where we're actually doing research here and the global consortium where we're giving grant money out, we're building a network, we're trying to bring together all of these people,
Right.
in different walks of life who have an interest here, who can help us with this problem.
But not only are you bringing people together and giving scientists money to pursue this research, but you are also becoming the umbrella organization in the world of being able to ask questions about women and men, by definition, hormonal changes that affect our lifespan and health span.
Exactly.
And this becomes the center, not just for Marin, the Bay Area, California, and the United States, but for the world.
That's the goal.
and let women who are trying to do a startup and to ask questions about hormones, let them make sure that they know about it,
Mhm.
because we have so many scientists that are looking at different aspects that it's just an unbelievable opportunity to move the ball down further, faster.
Further, faster. That's exactly right. And, before we stepped into the space, a year and a half ago,
Right.
almost 2 years ago,
Yeah, that's true.
there were very few scientists working on this problem. We've added a few to those
Right.
ranks,
Right.
but we have really aspirational goals in terms of building the field and really truly answering some of these questions that we talked about today, right? So questions about what is the right amount, what is the right timing,
Right.
what is the right formulation,
Exactly.
right? So there's
Exactly.
different kinds of estrogen-like compounds that can, act in one tissue but not another.
That's right.
There's a lot of nuance around this, and there's so much work to be done. So
Exactly.
much work to
Exactly.
be done, and it's actually daunting.
But the idea of having everyone in one place, at least having the resources to be able to ask these questions and connect with scientists that have been asking these questions for as long as you have and as long as the Buck has in terms of aging, we will all get ourselves further and learn better and faster by joining together. And I think that's an opportunity a lot of people don't have. If you think about us and COVID vaccine, we managed to get all the walls down to be able to create within a year of a pandemic a vaccine.
Right.
I mean, kudos to every single person that did that,
Right.
right? And we can do the same for women
We
and
are trying
for
to do the same.
Right,
That is exactly right. We're trying to get people to talk to each other who don't normally talk.
Right.
Clinicians,
Yes.
scientists.
Exactly.
Here we are having a discussion.
exactly.
But also people in tech and venture capital,
Right.
philanthropists, but also you watching this webinar. We need ambassadors to spread the word about what we're doing. So we're going to do this every month. I'll have a different guest every month, but Lizellen has
Yeah.
so much information and she's so fun to talk to that
we have
we're
a good
having
time.
her back
We have a
next
good time.
month.
Exactly.
Because we thought we couldn't get past, menopause and hormone replacement therapy takes, it took the whole hour. We could have continued talking about this for
Right.
another hour or two or
Right.
three,
Yes.
based on
There's lots more.
our private discussions.
Yes. Yes.
But there's a lot more to talk about in terms of debunking some of the myths around women's health.
Right.
for women who are younger, who have not yet gone through menopause, right?
Yes.
So we're going to talk about that next month.
Right.
So let's see. We have some questions from the audience, which we will try to answer.
Yes.
Here. Let me see. So David Furman asks, can you please comment or maybe even hypothesize on why hormone receptors are expressed so ubiquitously in different tissues? This gets into, this is a pretty sciencey question.
This is her question.
Well, the answer is it's really complex, right? So we didn't dive into all of the complexities around the different kinds of receptors. So there's at least 3 different kinds of estrogen receptors. There's multiple different kinds of progesterone receptors. And these receptors, remember, this is the lock we're talking about. Right. They're not all built the same. Right. And so what I mean by that is, when the estrogen binds to its receptor on a cell, then it activates all this stuff downstream. It turns on a bunch of stuff that happens. Right. And what happens and what it turns on can be different depending on what the receptor is, what form of the hormone is, because there's multiple forms of estrogens as well.
Yes.
And it also depends on when and where it's expressed in what kind of cells, because what it can do downstream, what it can turn on, really depends on what is in that cell. Our cells are not all built the same. They have different stuff in them. So it becomes a combinatorial problem. So I guess I would say that, I think that nature has used this system to have, 2 or 3 or 5 different components to get lots of different outcomes, because it's flexible, it's great. So it makes it hard for us to figure out, but from a biological standpoint, it's you're getting a lot of bang for buck if you can get estrogen and its receptor to do different things in the brain than it does in, say, the bone.
Yes, exactly.
So that's what I would say about that.
That's exactly right. And to keep making sure that we're actually learning. I mean, I think one of the big concerns we have had, and one of the greatest things about having CRLE and this group of scientists, has to do with the idea that women haven't been studied. So the conclusions in all of the scientists' articles, is a wonderful editorial by 2 women PhDs at Scientific American this month, and talks about, look, whatever conclusions you had, guess what, guys? We're starting from 0. So luckily, scientists here at the Buck and with all of these people have been doing an awful lot of science moving forward, but the prejudice of even male mice versus female, it's like, come on,
don't
guys.
get me started.
Okay, I won't get started.
We're gonna have to talk about this in a different webinar, because
the
fact that there is very little preclinical data in women,
exactly,
is a problem.
Yes.
Okay. So Saritha asks, if a woman's on estrogen progesterone medication throughout her adult life premenopausally, so before she goes through menopause, are there more effects of this postmenopausally than other than already having the receptors there? So that's tricky. This timing issue is very tricky.
Right. Well, I think there's 2 parts. You don't need to be on estrogen and progesterone before menopause unless your ovaries have been removed. All right. So I would question the benefit of actually being on that ahead of time. However,
because you have it, I mean, your body's already making
it. Yes, exactly.
Right? So
and you already have
you've got
enough.
The perfect amount in the right places at the right time. So why would you want to mess with that?
You have enough receptors. So that's a good thing. I think what the other question has to do with, are there enough receptors to continue to go forward, because you've sort of, made sure that physiologically you've kept them in basically alive and working, and that's an interesting question. I don't know if we know that answer, that and I would say if you're premenopausal, many people have hot flashes and night sweats, and hormones will help that, and they're not menopausal, are they preserving more receptors by adding back some hormones, and will that help them in life? It's a great question. I don't think we know that.
No, that's something that we would want to do a study.
Right. Good. Thank you very much.
Martha asks, why is a fracture the worst thing that can happen in terms of osteoporosis? This is an excellent question. Why is that? I mean, breaking bones when you're young doesn't really matter, right? You just put on a cast and heal it up.
Exactly. Number 1, healing is delayed. Number 2, healing is not as good. Number 3, because of the instability of the skeleton with basically bone loss, is you could get a fracture over on here on one vertebral body, and that becomes a cascade of next vertebral bodies. So it's not just a one and done. It seems to actually, it can lead to other problems.
Right. Well, and especially in older people, forget about just women,
Yes,
but in
that's right.
older men and women, having a fracture is actually a dramatic thing that can dramatically increase the risk of death, right? Because going to the hospital, not a good thing if you're old. Not being able to get up or move around,
the mobility
not a good
factor.
thing. It's really a bad thing. And so there are statistics. I'm actually not familiar with exactly what the numbers are, but your risk of death goes up dramatically if you have to go to the hospital. As an elderly
So
person.
if you look at the statistics of the women that came off hormone replacement therapy at the recommendation of this study we've been talking about, and then went on to have a hip fracture, their mortality was in the 30 to 40%. I mean, it's so dramatic that one could ask the question, how many deaths did we cause by withholding hormones? And that number is probably on us.
Staggering.
And it's not
Probably
great.
is.
No.
Marty asks, please say more about sugar in your blood. Did you say you regularly measure hemoglobin A1C?
I do.
We started to go there and we got sidetracked.
So I have to say that one of the things that's so interesting about blood sugar is it's its own category of receptors and issues. And if you look at America and you look at obesity and you look at diabetes, the ability to detect a pre-diabetic situation with a hemoglobin A1C, which is looking at fasting blood sugars for 3 months before you get the blood drawn, you may be surprised that you're closer to diabetes than you should be. And our job as physicians is to say, okay, let's talk about it. What are you doing? What's your sugar intake? But really bread and unrefined sugar and, things that really you can make a big difference with. And so if we're able to preemptively find, number one, measure, and then treat, we may actually delay or maybe prevent diabetes over time. And all the sequelae, vascular problems, eyesight problems, weight problems and all that. So,
and that's true in men and women. But we also know that metabolic dysfunction is is for whatever reason, we still have to figure this out. But metabolic dysfunction is really tightly linked to a woman's reproductive health and her reproductive span. So, the age at which she goes through menopause, which determines her overall lifespan. So if you have a young woman who's otherwise healthy but has metabolic dysfunction, you can bet that she probably has something else going on underlying in her reproductive system.
And that's for our next webinar to talk about what can we influence to basically maximize your chances of fertility.
Let's see, Mary Zelinsky. Hi, Mary. Mary asks, you focused on considerations regarding hormone replacement therapy for women with a history of breast cancer. What about women with a history of cardiovascular disease?
So my original research before I even went to med school was I worked for a cardiac surgeon for 10 years in San Francisco, long before I started medical school, because I couldn't decide to get to medical school, but I got there. Anyway, so one of the things that was interesting is that we showed that women who have the diagnosis of a heart attack are typically 10 and 15 years older than their male counterparts, unless somebody has taken out their ovaries. So cardiovascular risk is what we should all be talking about. It's more important than breast cancer risk, not from the perspective that breast cancer isn't something, but women in postmenopausal breast cancer get treated and they are fine. And they're dying of heart disease and stroke, 53%. So we need to be having the cardiac surgeons and the cardiologists at the table. There's a wonderful doctor at USC who's really been fighting for getting good information about hormones and protective for the heart and making sure the studies are long enough to make that difference. And so one of the things that we really want to know about is let's protect your heart and your head over time. And let's learn more.
Would you recommend hormone replacement therapy for healthy women within 10 years of entering menopause?
Well, I think your data was clear. I think that there's some interesting statistics about the average age of menopause is 51. If you're lucky enough to go to menopause later, then that's even better. But this idea that if you are 60, which I think may be arbitrary in terms of what the cutoff is, probably the benefits are not necessarily going to outweigh the risks. I mean, I think we have this conversation again. So that's one of the things. So I think, but if you're closer to menopause, if you're 5 years or less, or you're currently having symptoms, then of course we'd have that conversation and talk about it. Yes.
Yeah, but definitely talk to your doctor,
Right.
obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it really does change based on your personal and your biological history.
And risk reward personally. I am somebody who is willing to take risks on things because I know that I'm going to be watching things. But some people are fearful, and I understand that. The mental illness related to fear of cancer is not insignificant. And if they don't want to have that worry, then that's a different answer.
And this is a related question. You briefly mentioned that that starting hormone replacement therapy more than 10 years after menopause could be harmful. Can you expand?
Well, I don't know that it's harmful. I mean, initially,
there's a few studies that suggest it.
Yeah.
But and we are hypothesizing here.
Yes.
we're just thinking out loud. But one of the things that is clear is that the number of receptors that a woman has goes down with age, estrogen receptors, and postmenopause that's accelerated. And so if you wait 10 years, as you said with your 62-year-old patient who probably had them, if you wait 10 years after menopause, it's likely that the level of receptors in the tissues that you care about, like your brain and your bone, and that they might not be there. And so in that case, there might not be any effect.
There may not be as much of a positive effect as we could imagine. Initially, some of the studies, interestingly enough, that came out probably 10 and 20 years ago, suggested that if you were on oral estrogen and progesterone, and you were 15 years menopausal, there was an increased risk of a heart attack in that first year. So I always tell people, look, maybe you could start again now, but there's a little risk this first year that we have to be very careful. So again, risk benefit. But I think this issue of, do you still have receptors? Is it going to make a difference in terms of your vascular resistance to add it now? Could we get more estrogen receptors that are quietly dormant because they haven't found the key? By adding it back? None of this we know. So we're certainly on hypothesizing now.
Okay. Well, on that note,
yes,
we'll use a big word and then we'll end.
Yes.
I'm gonna thank you, Lizellen.
My
this was
pleasure.
lovely. I love talking to you about these things.
Yeah.
Thank you to you all for watching and for all of your questions. I did not get to even a third of them, and so we will circle back and try to answer these either through the OVA newsletter or through the JCRLE network page. But thank you for listening, and I'm going to toss this back now to Brian. Are you there, Brian?
Yes, I am.
Hey.
Thanks so much, both Jennifer and Lizellen. Amazing conversation, and I'm so happy that we get to revisit this next month on July 1st. So please, couple things. We got a lot of requests for people asking how can they stay involved and connected, and we have a couple of solutions for you. So one of the first things you can do is become an OVA member. We've created a membership just for people who want to stay connected and involved and really keep their finger on the pulse of what's going on. And we send out newsletters, we invite people to special chats. So if you look at your chat window, you can find a link to how to join OVA. Also, you can go to the Buck website, and there's lots of ways to get there, either by going through the support menu or just even doing a search for OVA. And membership is only $100, and it allows us to support the science, but also to continue with these webinars. And you can see how valuable and how informative they are. Also, we've got a lot of requests after the last webinar of people who want to really be part of this journey and really help support the science. As Jennifer said, we're trying to move things further faster, and we're trying to accelerate the discovery. We've had a number of people come forward who have donor advised funds who are using that to help support our researchers here at the Buck. And so we have a lot of expertise on that. If you have a donor advised fund and want to put that philanthropic capital to work, just give us a call or email us at ova@buckinstitute.org. That's ova@buckinstitute.org. And we'd be happy to help you and plug you into the science that you care most about. So with that, we're going to wrap up, and please do come back next month. We do these webinars the first Thursday of every month. Jennifer and Lizellen will be back, and we will continue this conversation. And as Jennifer said, we'll circle back and send out responses and replies to the questions that we didn't have time to get to today. so that you'll have the benefit of both of their feedback. So once again, thank you for joining OVA Hour. We'll see you next month on July 1st. Have a great day, and thanks again. Take care, everybody.